Hello, and welcome to the Regional Housing Council meeting of September 28th, 2022. Let's do a check-in of who's here. And Tom Water was quick to get to the table, so why don't we start there?
Hi, Michael Althauser, Tumwater City Council. I'm joined by Council Member Joan Caffey, as well as our City Administrator John Doan and Brad Medred from our Planning Department. Happy to be here.
Great. Thank you. And looks like the county is here now. So Carolina, do you want to?
Sure. Carolina Mejia, Thurston County Commissioner, and joining us is County Manager Ramiro Chavez, Tom Webster, Keely Marino, Jacinda Stelgis, and that is all I am seeing currently. Elisa Sparkman is also here, and Megan Porter.
Wonderful. Full house here from the county. And Olympia?
Hi there, Jim Cooper from the council. I have Danny Madrone from the council, interim assistant city manager Rich Hoy, and our housing director Darian Lightfoot. Good to see everyone.
Hey, welcome. And I'm Carolyn Cox from City of Lacey. And we have here our mayor, Andy Ryder, who's our alternate representative to this council. And I know we have Kelly Adams. I think we're supposed to have some other staff here, but I don't see them yet. So I think that's it. Andy, unless you saw somebody that I didn't on the list here. Okay, great. Well, we'll welcome them when they get here. And I'm told that we don't have anybody signed up for public comment. But is there anybody who has registered on the meeting that wants to make public comment? That I'm gonna look at the participants list here really quick.
I see no raised hands, Chair.
Thank you. All righty. Well, let's assume there's not and move on to approving the agenda for today. Do I have a motion?
So moved. This is Carolina.
All right.
I'll
Do I hear
second.
Michael seconds. Okay. Any comment on the agenda? Hearing none, all in favor of approving it, please say aye.
Aye.
Hi.
Any opposed? Doesn't sound like it. Okay. Can I get a motion to approve the September 14th minutes?
So moved.
Okay. Do you hear a second?
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any comments on the minutes? All right, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none. We are moving on here. Now, we had invited Sam Gibney, who had offered to come and meet with us a little time on the agenda. I also invited Craig Chance from the Housing Authority to talk about the Oyo Hotel situation. Has Sam joined the group yet?
Yes, Chair, I'm promoting them to panelists right now.
Okay, great.
I'm also promoting Warren Hendrickson.
All right. Do you want to, are you promoting Craig as well?
Yes, Chair.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Warren, how are you?
Excellent. Thank you for the invitation.
Good.
There, now I'm unmuted. Hello.
Hi, how are you, Sam?
Good. How are you?
Oh, pretty good. Well, why don't we let you start here. And we obviously have Warren, and I invited Craig Chance from the Housing Authority as well. So we have a little over
Great.
20 minutes now for this, since we were so efficient at the top of the meeting. So,
Okay, and is somebody else going to bring up my PowerPoint?
I'm happy to do that for you. Just one moment.
Thank you. And while she's doing that, I will introduce Warren Hendrickson, and he is our new airport senior manager. And Warren has just joined the port a couple months ago. He is a great addition to our team and comes with us with just a wealth of experience, and was formerly with the Port of Bremerton. He actually sits on the Governor's Commercial Aviation Coordinating Council, and was formerly with Pilots Association, et cetera. So we're very lucky to have Warren join us, and we will actually be kind of toggling back and forth on some of these slides. And so I will hand it over to him on a couple of the slides. Great.
alrighty.
So we are here to give you an update on the question of a land release from FAA on properties. They are both on one parcel. It's the Oyo and Comfort Inn Hotel property. And in specific, I know there's been interest in the Oyo Hotel property. So get on the next slide. So I'm going to race through some of these because I know a lot of you are very familiar, but we are looking at the intersection of Tumwater Boulevard and I-5, and where the two hotels are located. Go to the next slide. Do want to point out that this property was originally transferred. It had gone through a couple different ownerships, but it was transferred back in 1963 and is all part of one parcel that was part of a Federal Surplus Act transfer from the federal government to the Port of Olympia. And the black circle identifies where the two hotels are located. Next slide. So the hotels are owned by a private corporation. They are tenant-owned facilities, and they are on port-owned land that is leased. That property again was initially acquired for airport purposes under the Federal Surplus Property Act. So there are some deed restrictions on the property, as well as other encumbrances through the funding of FAA. So this land is subject to FAA determinations. The current leases run through 2043, and there is another 30-year option available on it. Next slide. Again, the two hotels, Comfort Inn and Oyo. Next one. Some pictures. Again, I know many of you are familiar with this. Next slide. So at the very beginning of this year, we were tasked to really take an even closer look at what the considerations were for any type of potential surplus from the FAA. As background, the considerations that under the Surplus Act, that typically long-term residential uses are not allowed. Hotels are not considered long-term residential use. So we often get asked that of like, how can there be a hotel there, but you're not allowed to have housing? And that's an FAA interpretation. And that is seen throughout the country. They have this interpretation. The current site use proposal is also currently incompatible with the City of Tumwater zoning, though I do know that there's been a great deal of interest expressed by the City of Tumwater of both changing the zoning, as well as there's been some, I think, other overlays. So, you know, that is probably not as set in stone as some other factors. The FAA in 2021 did write the port a letter. So we've had correspondence with both the FAA, and then earlier this year we then went sought the counsel of a specific aviation planning group, which is a aviation a planning consultant that really deals specifically with these types of land use matters for and the FAA. But they have told us that, disposal shall not be granted unless it will benefit civil aviation. And that is often the standard that is put out for any type of this type of land transfer, is that the FAA really doesn't consider any other type of public benefit. They specifically look at benefits to civil aviation. And yet we really wanted to make sure that we were understanding that correctly. And so we've gone out, asked for it, and I believe a copy of that was provided to you in your packet. They also look at what is the particularly the revenue impact to the port and the airport long term. And I think it's important to realize that the way that this type of additional land area is often attached to the operating side of the airport is that they were really designated and granted to FAA or airport sponsors in order that other land, the revenue, would continue in perpetuity to support the airport operations. Go to the next slide. Warren, I'm going to hand this over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sam. And good afternoon, everyone. The yellow box that you see in front of you is a direct interpretation of the guidelines from the WSDOT Aviation Compatible Land Use Guidebook in Appendix F. For the type of airport and runway layout that we have at Olympia Regional, there is a Zone 6 compatibility zone. There are 6 total zones, 6 being the one that goes the greatest distance from the airport, with recommendations as to what is and is not a compatible land use within those zones. In this particular case, the yellow rectangle is Zone 6. It goes the furthest distance from the airport. It's 6,000 feet out from the runway center line. And you can see the parcel in question is directly inside that box. As a result of being inside the box and falling within Zone 6, there are limitations on the property use that would be compatible for that proximity to the airport. One of which would be very limited impact on residential housing. So although it's not regulatory, this is a guidebook, but as a state guidebook, it parallels the reading and the impressions that we have received thus far from the FAA.
Okay, next slide. So some of the considerations in looking at what the analysis and what the long-term impact would be is that this is a heavily wooded parcel that should result in a lower mitigation requirements per the Habitat Conservation Plan, which means that it actually has probably increased development potential. It is a very high value property based on location and immediate I-5 access. Lots of potential for the current zoning of business and industrial use. And again, this residential incompatibility. Next slide. I want to turn it over to Warren to kind of summarize some of the conclusions.
So in this particular case, again, this is the Aviation Planning Group. Leah Whitfield is the president and owner as the advisor for our airport master plan update. And so she provided that June 9th memo that is in your packet from a few months ago. And that was the additional assistance. We wanted an outside consultant to take a look from a impartial aspect as to the actual process. And that was the result of the memo. Research, background, recent experience. And the memo essentially identifies all the regulatory guidance that applies, recent experience, primary barriers to success, which primarily, when it boils right down to it, are financial and compatible land use, the submittal process, and then the next steps. In this particular case, I actually have personal experience from my most recent position as airport director at Bremerton National Airport. There was a request for a land release by a private tenant leasing airport property. And that also ran into literally a brick wall. In that case, the property was even more restrictive because it was in what a safety zone of the airport runway. And the land was also originally purchased by FAA dollars. So again, it's just such a high barrier to reach. And this memo does go through and explain that process and the barriers that have to be overcome. Next slide. Back to you, Sam.
Great. And so, you know, I would reiterate that the Port of Olympia and particularly our new commission is very specific in that that we really understand and support the objectives of the Regional Housing Council to address housing needs in our community, understands that is a crisis. And the challenges with this particular parcel remain, again, the kind of current future land use zoning, not just from the Tumwater side, but from this compatibility issue, that we do have this overlay of restrictions and the state land use compatible. The biggest probably hurdle that we have, and the FAA goes through a rigorous process to show, you know, if you were to surplus this property, what would you be, how would you basically be replacing that revenue for the airport? And so the memo recognizes, and we as staff concur, that it would be difficult to demonstrate to the FAA how a release would ultimately benefit the airport, because that is the primary criteria that they look at. And next slide. So with that, we'll open it up for any questions that you might have.
Righty, Andy.
Yes. So understanding that it needs to possibly remain as a hotel, is there any reason why the housing authority couldn't purchase this hotel and continue to run it as a hotel?
No, if they were running it as a hotel, that would be considered an already permitted land use. I mean, that's what's being done there now.
So we're talking about semantics to a degree, right? I mean, if the housing authority were to buy it and they gave out vouchers for temporary stays, it would be very similar to what they do right now with other hotels.
Mm-hmm. You know, I would say that would require some type of determination from FAA. Warren, how do you think that would? I mean, if they,
well, I can let you know that this has happened in other ports. I've
Okay.
been very active in the National League of Cities, and we're not the only
Right.
region that has looked at exactly what we're doing right now.
Okay.
And I know areas have taken over hotels on port property, and so how you get there is always a question, but there's no reason why another entity couldn't come in, purchase the hotel and continue to run it sort of as a hotel, but with a focus on a specific group of people that they're trying to help with a hotel. Now there has to be a lease that goes on with the port, and that's understandable. I never expected that the port was just gonna give the property over.
right.
I still feel like there's a path forward here. It's semantics at this point.
Certainly, and if you have other examples, that would be helpful. In this instance, our consultant didn't find those, but I certainly, we could look at those, and if they were able to run it as a hotel, I don't see, that's what the permitted use is currently.
And I would add to the examples that other locations may have purchased hotels that are on port property. The question I have is was it also not only port property, but also airport property where there was subject to the additional layer of regulatory guidance? And so that would be the only thing. And if that exists, that gives us an example or a template to follow, then that might be a path to a reasonable solution. But
Absolutely.
Okay. I think I saw Michael's hand up. Did I?
Yeah, this will be really quick. I just wanted to point out just regarding the zoning within the city.
Mhm.
Earlier this year, we changed the zoning rules, like the contemplated use for this property is allowed in that zone. Like when this preliminary report came out, I checked with our staff and this is an allowable use within
Okay.
the zoning that currently exists for the city.
Yes, and again, I think there was some change over there, and recognize that the Tumwater zoning is not the limiting factor here by any stretch.
Yeah, our zoning allows for that.
Okay. Just mention, Tom, did I see you kind of do a hand a little bit? No, okay, Jim?
Thank you. Thank you for this. It's helpful to
Mhm.
see the considerations. You know, I think the thing when I hear all of that that's different from the example, you know, that was given right on top of a runway is, you know, you're out on the outer edge of the outer ring, literally on top of a freeway interchange. And so my question is that 6,000 feet surveyed? Because when I measure it on geodata, the center line of the freeway on-ramp is less than 6,000 feet. And so just kind of or right around, you know, it's all right around 6,000 feet is what I'm trying to say. And just curious, you know, within the margin of error of aerial mapping versus surveying, do you really know where that 6,000 foot line lies?
Well, that was an overlay using the Thurston County geodata and verified with Google Earth, and I get the same answer. It was a self-determination by my part, certainly subject to some rule of error, but whether
We
it's
don't have like a
inside or
survey
outside the
benchmark
box,
or anything for
again,
that.
that yellow box is not regulatory, it's guidance. And so
Okay.
there are other priorities to meet, but it is just one additional factor when we look at what are all the factors we have to consider is not just the federal, but what does the state say, what applies, what does the city zoning say? And so it's federal, state, and local. All three entities have a role in the final outcome.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And you know,
Yeah.
I almost won't say, I almost don't want to say this out loud because I know government's not always reasonable. But when I think about all of the things that have been said outside of the revenue consideration long term, this would pass a reasonable sniff test to me if I was a regulator. Like it's not by the airport. So, thank you. So I guess I should follow up with, has the Port Commission made a decision that they're not pursuing this? Am I hearing that or not?
The Port decision, the Port Commission has not made any additional decisions about this, in large part because you know, we have not had any proposals from the current lessee of the property. So our existing tenant has not brought any type of proposal to us to sell the property and assign it in any way. So there's really no action for us to consider at this point. If that were to change, I will make a brief mention that that is complicated now by some other legal proceedings that are happening. So the Port Commission has not had any other direction because we don't have, to the best of my knowledge, we don't have any other type of proposal or request from our existing tenant.
That makes sense. You have to have something to react to. Thank you, Carolyn. I just say if there's not more questions, it might be good to hear what from Craig. But.
I was going to ask a follow-up to that answer, if that's possible, really quick.
All right, and then Andy and Carolina had their hands up too, so.
Why don't you guys go first? You had your hands up before me.
Well, I guess my question is what happens if the current lease or the person's leasing the property defaults on the property? What does the port then take it over, and then is there like a bid out to take over the lease?
There will be a determination through bankruptcy and other proceedings as to what happens to the built assets. The port remains the lessor and the property owner, and our interests are considered in that. So I can't really speculate on that until those proceedings come to some type of conclusion.
Nope, no problem. Thank you.
Go ahead, Michael. I was just gonna ask to kind of hear from Craig, so.
Yeah. Okay. I was just gonna say I've had a half dozen conversations with I guess she's the lessee. I always get those terms confused, lessee, lessor. But Shami, about the property. She owns the building and the port owns the land.
Correct.
So the port, so she's leasing the land
Correct.
from the port. So if Shami expressed interest in terms of saying, I would like you to explore a release along these lines, then that would be informative to your decision-making process, it sounds like.
Yes, to a certain extent. I think that we have we have been responsive to that, to like, here would be the process. I think for there to go to the next step, it would have to actually have to be I want to sell my buildings on the property, and I want to go through an actual lease assignment, because then we would need to engage the next level of analysis.
Right. I guess like the challenge I've always seen from this from the start is it sort of seems like a catch-22, where the owner of the building can't sell it to, I don't know, a nonprofit that wants to work on housing things until this federal thing gets done. But the federal thing can't get done until the owner presents a purchase and sale agreement and says that they want to sign over the lease. So it seems like I guess I'm just challenged by the fact that it seems like she can't do anything until somebody else does something. Somebody else can't do anything until she does something. So, but it seems like the person or the entity that could do something that doesn't have sort of a legal barrier is the port. Like there's nothing that, right, there's no legal barrier for the port actually engaging in the FAA process. It's just that you want to be respectful of your tenant, which I totally understand. You don't want to get ahead of your tenant on it.
Right. And that is the conundrum right there, is that we are prohibited from beginning proceedings with the FAA unless we were have some type of binding indication from the current tenant that indeed she wants to pursue this, because what she has an interest, we can't interfere with that. So if she were to present us with a purchase and sale agreement that she would have somebody and say, I want to assign this lease, and here's the purchase and sale agreement, then we could begin that process. But to date, to the best of my knowledge, we've not been presented with that.
Well, this seems like a good time to bring Craig into the conversation if he's ready to kind of let us know where Housing Authority sits on this. And I know you've had some conversations with the hotel owner.
Manny. Well, thank you, everybody, and in particular, Sam and Warren, thank you for your thoughtful presentation. Just on the last few comments, a little clarification, and Warren, Sam, jump in here if you have a different perception. But if the property was to have what we're broadly calling the FAA release, the FAA would require that the land be sold. And so the price would be the Housing Authority or some other purchaser in this kind of a scenario buying the building from Shami's LLC and buying also the land from the port at a fair market price. So there would not be an assignment of the lease if that was the direction that we've all talked about. I also want to thank on behalf of the Housing Authority. This has been going on for quite a while now, since December of 2020. And there are a lot of people in the community, a lot of entities that have offered encouragement, and we appreciate it. But particular company here, I think we owe special thanks, the Housing Authority, special thanks to Thurston County to the cities of Lacey, Olympia, and Tumwater for encouragement and assistance and support in the consideration of the project. Council Member Cox, you specifically said when we first talked, can you indicate whether you still have an interest as a housing authority? So that'd be a simple answer. Yes, we still have an interest. We still see that there's a need there. As I mentioned, we launched this back in December 2020, and prior to picking up that phone on a rainy day to call Shammy and say, would you be interested? We did a fair amount of research. We picked up a title report, ordered it through one of the local providers. We obtained some information from the FAA, and of course some of that was reinforced with information that the port subsequently received directly from the FAA. So we recognized there were numerous challenges, but really we felt that the great opportunity, the great joy is looking past the problems and to the opportunity, and the opportunity is significant. And what was particularly attractive about this property was that it's a suite style hotel, so it's much easier to convert into long-term housing. And because of some dynamics of that property, candidly available land and building for a much lower price than any similar property. And if things went well, could be done much quicker than trying to build, and building is just horrendously expensive. This looks like pocket change when you look at what building costs are today, and it's an existing building. So, we're not disrupting existing space. We also have some experience in working with federal agencies. The one closest to us, of course, is HUD, and it just came up as an ironic example today. Today, we had HUD officials down to visit with us about programs and our activities, and they had a particular interest in going out and visiting Quixote Village, which I think most of you are familiar with, up on the west side of Olympia in the Mountain Industrial Park, a village of tiny houses. When Quixote Village first brought up the concept, it was, well, we need some operating money through project-based vouchers, but the design of that property doesn't allow project-based vouchers. There are a whole bunch of obstacles. So we said, well, we're going to have to negotiate with HUD. HUD's also a pretty big agency, and bluntly, those initial efforts to reach out to HUD weren't particularly encouraging. The rules are the rules, and lots of people have to approve them. Besides that, we like the rules. Well, eventually HUD listened, and they provided waivers. And today, Quixote Village is recognized as a national success story, which is part of the reason the HUD officials were down here, is let's go out and visit this success story that we were involved in by providing waivers. So kudos to HUD for listening. We believe there's a case to be made that this transaction could benefit civil aviation. And yes, we recognize the revenue, but an important concept here is what finance people call time value of money. It's the dilemma that everybody who wins the lottery has. Would you rather receive $1 million this afternoon, or would you rather get about half of that amount of money now, is what they really do, or would you rather get $50,000 a year for the next 20? It's a function of, again, a dollar today is always worth more than a dollar tomorrow, and it's how you discount it. The riskier that cash flow is, the less amount you'd be willing to receive today. And we perceive it as, it's not a treasury bond here. The property has had its financial challenges, as our friends at the port alluded to. And so there's some discounted value that might be just equivalent per financial theory to have today versus the hoped for cash flow in the future. We also, when we did our initial research, we read the port's master plan for the Newmarket area. And when it discusses the retail area, which encompasses the hotel, complete with a picture of the subject hotel, it said that performance in the development of that area had been disappointing. It's partly an egress issue, a visibility issue, and these are reasons why the hotel is also available a little bit more attractive price. We thought if we could get people there, have people full-time living there, it might be more attractive to other kinds of development in the retail area that would take land that's currently not generating any revenue into developing and generating revenue that ultimately benefits all the good things that civil aviation does. We also recognize that Our current federal administration and also the immediate past administration in different ways have been pretty clear in saying there's a connection between economic development and housing, in particular supplying housing for our more vulnerable neighbors. I've had a lot of people say what motivates us, and I think a lot of you have heard me say it's the emails we get. All of our staff, including myself, get emails from seniors or family members or caregivers of seniors who are in need. And let me just kind of paraphrase a short message. It was one that came this week, and it said, and this is talking about a married couple, our living situation is serious and not healthy. We live in a 25-foot RV with no way to shower or wash clothes. I do wash things in the bathroom sink. I am 82 years old, and this person still works because they have to. They don't have enough Social Security income to support themselves. Writer goes on to say, I deserve better. I have a serious bladder problem. I need a place to bathe. I'm also blind in my left eye and have a serious damaged right hand that I ran through a table saw trying to cut kindling for a wood stove where we used to live. Thank God it's healed, but it still makes it difficult to use. I am almost deaf. It's a little more dramatic than some of the emails, but they're all very much like this. People only on Social Security income. And we envisioned at the OEO, it's a 58-unit property, 1 unit for a on-site manager, 22 units for people who wouldn't have a voucher. There just aren't enough vouchers for all the vulnerable neighbors who are eligible by income for one. So we could offer 22 units at about $500 a month, all in, utilities and everything. That's affordable to a lot of folks on Social Security. And the balance would be people supported by vouchers. So long story short, yes, the Housing Authority remains interested in virtually all potential ways to provide decent housing in our community for these elder neighbors who are so vulnerable. And we would say the hotel, if the board is willing to pursue this, remains one of the potential opportunities. At one point, we did have an agreement with Chamois. As the process is ground on, it kind of came and it went, and we heard, gee, it might take 12, 18 months to think about it and run through the FAA. And realistically, it's not reasonable to tie anyone up, especially somebody who wants to sell for 18 months. And so we were hopeful, and I think it'd be fair to say, not here to speak for self, Chamois is hopeful that maybe some kind of decisions could be made a little quicker. But yes, we're interested in it. We respect the board has its perspective and interests, and we are actively right now started construction on other property for the general public. Out in Tumwater, we have property where we're soon going to begin planning for 50 more units. And there's a project in the very early stages that might turn into senior housing. So it's not the only iron in the fire, but if things turn properly, we certainly remain interested. Again, thank you, everybody, for your support and encouragement as this project's been considered. Thank you.
So if I understood Sam correctly, you all are waiting for a proposal. You can't do anything without a proposal. So,
Yes.
Craig, is there a chance that you and Chamois could get together and make a proposal to the port?
Certainly.
Okay.
Can I push back on that, Carolyn?
Mhm.
The Port Commission could decide to surplus the property and unencumber it first, though, right? With no proposal.
Doesn't sound like it.
I think because of the legal proceedings right now, that would be prohibited at this point.
Yeah.
Because we do have a lease so we cannot unilaterally vacate that lease, in particular because that lease is in legal proceedings.
I understand. That makes more sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
And
I was
similar-
thinking of other legal proceedings. Now I get it. Thank you.
Because also what's going on, and I'll respect the privacy of the owner here. How do I say this gracefully? It may require other folks to decide on that agreement, and I don't think other folks in the process are going to allow a 12, 18-month agreement. If the process began, the FAA said, hey, thumbs up to all the above, then it can move a little quicker with everybody who has to decide.
So Craig, what do you see as the path forward? And then Carolina is up next.
Well, it's largely, the port's interest, and Sam, more in respect to your positions, there's been a lot of community conversation, but is it a deal that the port really would like to do, or is it more of a public relations issue and you really don't want it to proceed? If you have a seller who's not willing, as the appraisers like to say, it's not going to happen. And so it's hard to pour energy into a deal where really the organization, the property owner doesn't want to sell it.
And I'm looking to my other administrators on the line here. I'm always loath to speak for my legislative body. And at the same time, I would say that they have made it abundantly clear that they are, if there is a path forward, they are willing to proceed down that path. So I think that if there is a viable, an offer on the table and we can proceed, my reading of the tea leaves is that this commission would absolutely entertain such. That's and again, I'm not the elected officials, I'm not the body, but I get pretty good at reading the tea leaves.
Carolina?
I think, Commissioner.
Thank you. I feel like sometimes with government agencies, we tend to chase our own tails, and I feel like we're kind of like in this situation right now where we're just going around in circles. And my question for Craig was more on, and you kind of pinpointed that, right? Is there a willing seller? Because I think that was the hesitance of the housing authority beforehand. And you kind of nailed what my next question was going to be, was the fact that there might not have been that willing seller. So without having gone through the process, is the housing authority willing to put in a proposal forward? And then at that time, the port, depending on how the port commissioners move on this, then they would decide whether this would move forward or not. So I guess just hearing kind of Sam's response, Craig, kind of where are you at right at this time?
Short answer to your question would be yes. And so it becomes a question of, there's two purchase and sale agreements that have to happen. One would be with Shammy's family, the owner of the building, and the other for the land, the port. And again, I don't think, as was proposed earlier, it'd be like 12, 18 months. I just don't think that's going to fly given circumstances, and generally not commercially reasonable. And then it becomes a question of, the consultant provided the detail on what the history is of these kind of efforts with the FAA and what the steps are. I think it becomes a question then of, well, how quickly can we write the proposal up to the FAA? The housing authority in the past has said we're happy to help, although this time value of money thing, if you got the money up front, we propose to bankroll that, or there's capital improvements that the airport that are needed, we'd need to spend some time with the port if they want us to help write that. But at some point, if it's going to be, I heard, I think in one of the meetings, Sam, correct me because I don't have the notes in front of me, but I think one of the staff mentioned something like it'd be several months for the consultant to write that proposal. And if it was several months, again, for purchase and sale agreement, we get outside of what's commercially reasonable under the circumstances.
There is a bit of analysis. I think it is very clear that this current sitting commission would like to support this in any way possible. So we would then need to talk with the consultant and see what that time frame might be.
And is it necessary to have a consultant write the proposal? Our perception was it wasn't.
Right.
Now, that would have been kind of where we thought, let's just get something in front of the FA, give it the earnest, good college try or something like that. The expression goes, and if we're successful, let's celebrate and let's see if there's still some grant opportunities. Partly, we talked to one of our creditors about borrowing money. We talked about using some of our funds for it, but in order to get those units down to that low price, the concept was in part grant money. Some of those were COVID type monies, and some of those opportunities have come and gone. There's still some available. But we just thought, well, if we aren't successful and the FAA says go fly a kite, well, we tried. But we don't quite see the value in spending, is it $50,000 or $70,000 on a consultant to write it up, or to spend that much time.
Well, I want to thank Sam and Warren and Craig for coming here. I think, it's pretty clear the RHC would love to see a project like this happen to fill the gap, or help meet the gap in our affordable housing needs. So I hope you all can go forward. If there's anything this council can do to help, let us know.
Okay.
And again, thank you both, all three of you. And I'm afraid we need to move on to our next agenda.
Right.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Fingers crossed.
Okay,
Okay.
bye-bye.
Thank you. All righty. Next up is Keely with the EPRA recommendations.
Yes, thank you. Whoa, excuse me. So I'm here to talk about the recommendations coming from our review team for the 1277 EPRA funds. So as a reminder, in the legislative session, the 2021 legislative session, an additional document recording fee, House Bill 1277 was passed. And those funds were to go towards some homeless response. Rapid rehousing, they've been used for hotel funds, and then a significant portion set aside specifically for permanent eviction prevention rental assistance program. So as our TRAP and ERAP funds are winding down, these EPRA funds or 1277 funds are coming into play as our county's permanent rent assistance program. So on August 15th, we released an RFP. Half of that RFP you've already heard recommendations on, and those were for the housing and essential needs dollars, as well as rapid rehousing funds. The 1277 was also a part of that RFP, and it was a very interesting application and review process, as you will see. And I'm happy to share that with you now. All right, we had 5 applications. So it's as I said, pretty interesting funding round. We had 2 applications from ostensibly the same 2 agencies. However, one agency taking the lead and the other being kind of the subrecipient of that proposal. So Live Stories and Innovations Human Trafficking Coalition collaborated on 2 separate applications. That was a little bit confusing at first, but then it was clear when we read through them and reviewed them that they had very, very different tones and very different ideas about how programs would be implemented. And then we had another trifecta, I call it the Trifecta of Applications. So 3 applications came in from Partners in Prevention Education, Family Support Center, and Community Youth Services. They came in as separate applications. However, they had a letter that was signed by all 3 agencies in support of each other to come to present a unique way of distributing these funds. So the intent is that those 3 agencies individually applied for funds for specific populations. So single adults, families with children and survivors, and then youth and young adults. And that they would, in good faith, move together and create common policies shared between the 3 agencies to ensure that they are moving in lockstep with each other. So it was interesting. Initially, we had equal like the asks actually between the 3 agencies were $875,000 per pipe and family support center, and then $600,000 for community youth services. And I'm going to invite Tom to explain all of that in just a moment, but I'll just talk through the rest of the process. And so when looking at the applications, as you can see the scores and how they're distributed, clearly Family Support Center had an excellent application, 44 points out of 50. And so in our deliberations on how are we going to move forward in distributing these funds? If we look at scores, clearly Family Support Center had an excellent application, very clear processes, but that's just one segment of the population. They're not going to be reaching the entirety of the Thurston County, those of Thurston County who need rent assistance. In our current rent assistance programs, there was a requirement for set aside for youth and young adults, which Community Services has already been implementing. And then, of course, the biggest need we have in our community is around single adults. So when we looked at the score distribution, most of these scores are really close together, just a couple of like tenths of percents, distance between a few of them. So we looked at the collective scores or the average scores for the 3 agencies that came in as a united front to address this, to work with the EPRA fund program. And it averaged out to about 40. So again, we're talking just tiny percentage points of difference between the top scores. So we, another thing we noticed is that Partners in Prevention Education in their application, they are a buy-in-for agency in and of themselves, and they identified that in Innovations Human Trafficking would be a partner of theirs, who is also a buy-in-for agency in working through these applications. And so although the Innovations HTC Live Stories application was excellent, it was an excellent application, clearly it scored high. The concern was if we split up this trifecta that are all working together with common policies, procedures, and including funding fiscal procedures, then Innovations would not only be split between would be split between Innovations and Live Stories. So, and not in concert with the policies and procedures that have been decided on or will be decided on between the 3 agencies who we're recommending receiving funds. We did think about if we just gave Partners in Prevention just the $875 that they asked for, then could we not give $300,000 to the Innovations Live Stories collaboration? And again, the concern was, well, they're not in concert with the policies and that the other 3 agencies had put together. And again, a portion of that would be going to Live Stories for fiscal, and also Innovations up until this point has been pretty much really focused on those who are experiencing or have experienced human trafficking. And not that they couldn't, they're an excellent agency, they're growing really fast, but just in that was just some of the conversation around why we went with the decisions that we did. We are hopeful that they would consider partnership with Innovations at Pipewood. And I'll turn it over to Tom to talk about the distribution of funds that are being recommended.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So as she indicated, there were some hard conversations and tough decisions around this. So as Keely indicated, Pipe originally asked for $875, Family Support $875, and CYS $600,000. We're recommending reducing the CYS award, in part because CYS continues to have ERAP and TRAP funds that it has available to spend on youth and young adults. And we think that those funds are going to last longer than the single adult funding for those programs. So they're able to stretch out their ERAP and TRAP dollars a little farther. And then under kind of TRAP and ERAP, we set aside 10% of funds for youth and young adults, just for that kind of smaller age group. And so knowing that this is a much smaller program, we do not have the funding levels that we had under TRAP and ERAP. When we were spending, $20 million a year, this is going to be just over $2 million a year. That's, $300,000 is more than 10% of the total funds that were allocated for youth and young adults under TRAP and ERAP, but we didn't think the full 600,000 for that population was proportional to the total need, especially for single adults where there's the greatest need population wise. So that's why there was a reduction for the CYS award in terms of for our recommendation. So I think with that, we're open to any questions unless Keely, you had anything else you wanted to add.
I don't believe so. I think I'm just happy to answer any questions.
I have one if it's okay.
Of course.
Did we lose Carolyn? Oh no, there she is. Sorry, it was just the video, the blocking her. So I was curious. Two questions. The first one is, in the trifecta, do they have economies of scale around intake or processing and admin, or just that they're gonna kind of write policies? Like, I'm wondering if it'll be a one entry point for everyone for rental assistance or 3.
It would function very much like our current coordinated entry system, where there'd be 3 points of entry. That is one recommendation that we will make going forward, that in our RFP process that will be coming up in February of 2023, we will ask for, we would hope that there would be a single agency that could come forward and operate this program, just simply due to the fact that, you know, the admin fee is now going to be split between 3 separate agencies, rather than one take on the admin fee. So just decreasing incrementally, but decreasing the amount of funds available for rent assistance, just because we're splitting the admin across 3 different agencies.
Well, and could you not just lean in on that on contract negotiations and see if you could even get them further along now?
I suppose. I'm looking at Tom.
Yeah, certainly open to those conversations. I think, you know, all those agencies, there's some limitations. And I know PIPE specifically called out as a buying for organization with kind of, you know, may not have the fiscal capacity. They've kind of indicated they weren't ready to take on the full fiscal responsibility kind of as a lead agency. So hopefully there can be some maybe technical assistance as they grow their capacity, ability to do that in the future. But the indication in the application was that right now, PIPE wasn't quite ready to take on that role. And I don't think, you know, Family Support or CYS were ready to take that on. But I think that's definitely direction we'd like to see kind of as we move forward with this program.
I like that. Put them on the dance floor and then see if they get married. So then my second question is, you know, we have a range of 6 to 20 points below the maximum. And I'm just curious, is there, you know, one common, you know, slight weakness, or are they kind of all over the place when you look at these applications?
Well, clearly between the highest scoring, there was, you know, they're all very strong applications. I think that there were in the other 2 applications, there were concerns around capacity, around connection to buy-in for agencies, around processes, tried and true processes. There were with the live stories and the leading the application with IHTC. One of the things that was consistent in both of those applications actually was, you know, they had stated that in the last year they'd served, you know, a certain number of households, which was a significant, quite a substantially less number than households that would be served by this program. And so that gave us pause as well, that we were a little concerned about capacity. But yeah, so it was about process and about a lot around the buy-in for, and I'm looking to my other reviewers if you recall anything other than that, Darian, or.
That makes sense. I appreciate it. And thank you for the level of rigor on this.
Sorry, if we're ready, can I hear a motion to approve the proposed expenditures here?
So moved.
I'll second.
Okay, moved by Jim, seconded by Carolina. Any other discussion? Okay, All in favor of approving the recommendations for the EPRA funding, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thanks, Keely. And next up, we have Darian with the state capital funds project.
Yes, thank you so much. So I just wanted to bring a project proposal to y'all's attention this evening. I'm sure you're familiar with the rapid capital acquisition that we spoke about a couple months ago regarding the second hotel purchase. In the right-of-way project, we had an initial hotel that was in our package that we're moving forward with purchasing that single hotel. But we came to the RHC and said that there was a potential to purchase that second hotel if we were to get an application in quick enough to access the funds that were allocated from the state for Thurston County. We ended up passing on that application. However, Commerce has informed us that those funds allocated to Thurston County are still available, and they'll be coming available for a second round of application for us to apply for. Thurston County was allocated $7.8 million we have access to for the rapid capital acquisition. The goal of these funds is to purchase units that are easily rehabable and can be occupied within a 6-month time frame. So that the application is going to be out and ready for us to apply. I've identified a project that I think meets the needs and of the demographic we're looking to serve and meets the qualifications of the funding source. And so Rich and I have met with the owner of a property that we have identified in the city of Olympia, and we've met with the potential service provider. And so we're looking to continue conversations with the both of them, hoping to move an application forward to apply for the rapid capital acquisition. And so this is just to say, we're moving forward. There's not a requirement by the RHC at this time. There is a 5% match that is required for the application, but right now that would be on the service provider or the purchaser for that 5% match. If that doesn't pencil, or if it becomes something that could maybe make the application not go through, then I do plan on coming back to talk to the RHC on how we could support the project with the 5% match for the purchase and the rehab of the units. So that's all I have to say. The application I'm projecting to be due in the next couple of months, but in order to go into the application, you must have a purchase and sale agreement. So we do have to move quickly. And yes, it's a really cool project, and I'm feeling very hopeful. So happy to answer any questions.
Anybody have a question for Darian? Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Thanks, Darian.
Thanks.
All right. Going to move on now to the governance structure. But before we begin that conversation, I just want to welcome Brian Hess to the meeting. And I see that Lacey City Manager Scott Spence has joined us as well. So to let everybody know they're here. And Tom, do you want to get us started on the governance?
Sure. Thank you, Chair Cox. So just wanting to kind of take the next round in our conversation on the Rhc governance structure. So I'm not going to share my screen right now, but I can if that is helpful. So as part of the packet, we sent out the slides that show the Rhc governance structure that has been proposed. We added 2 slides to the end of that presentation, really talking about, or a couple slides, around what we see as the key questions that are still outstanding. And that really revolves around what is the role of the hat in the Rhc interim governance structure, both at the Rhc level and at the advisory board level. And then what we're proposing is next steps, kind of laying out those next steps of Olympia and the county executing their home fund ILA. There's some just final negotiations around some language, but that is getting very close. Then we're looking for the Rhc to approve the creation of the Affordable Housing and Homeless Services Advisory Boards, so we can move forward with finalizing the charter and start recruitment for those boards. determining the role of the HAT members, and then moving forward with proposed changes to the Rhc ILA. So those are what we are seeing as some of the next steps. And then we also wanted to share some thoughts along long term. This is not something that we've spent a lot of time talking about, but the tech team, as we look towards trying to figure out what the long-term structure of the Rhc will be, our recommendation would be look to hire a consultant to help us figure this out. We think there's some really big, difficult questions for the Rhc to contemplate around the creation of an independent Rhc structure in terms of, the financial role, staffing, roles and responsibilities, what's the role of the jurisdictions, and all that. So our recommendation would be to move forward with looking to hire a consultant to help us come up with that plan for the long-term governance structure. So that would be our recommendation. And so in your packet are a proposal to spend the next couple of months developing that scope, identifying kind of funding to pay for that consultant, and then hoping to issue an RFP by spring, May-ish or so of next year to go out to identify that to start the process for long-term structure. However, as part of that whole conversation, I know also Councilmember Cooper sent out some slides yesterday with some thoughts that he had in terms of how to incorporate the HAT into that organizational structure for the Rhc. So I want to make sure to give him an opportunity to speak to that. But I think for tonight, we're really looking for your guidance on, coming to a decision on the role of kind of HAT members at the Rhc, and then looking for your approval so we can move forward with finalizing the charters for the advisory boards and so we can start recruiting for those advisory board members. So that's where I think we are. But with that, I want to kind of open it up, and I don't know, Chair Cox, if you kind of where you want the conversation to go first. But I think the key decision we've had over the last couple meetings is really around this question of kind of the HAT members, kind of voting, non-voting members at the Rhc level. Is that a helpful frame to start the conversation?
Yes, I mean, I think that is kind of the critical decision before us on that. And then why don't we talk about that and then come to Jim's proposal, if that's all right with Jim. Okay. So just by way of background, before our most recent meeting, I think this body had pretty well settled on the position of, yes, we'd like to welcome HAT to the Regional Housing Council, but we don't feel it's appropriate that they have voting representation. We had quite a lively discussion at our last meeting, and we ended up putting this on pause until this meeting to continue on. So I kind of want to check in and see who has questions still dangling on this or comments, and let's see if we can't come to a conclusion and a decision today, because what I'm hearing from staff is that we're reaching that critical juncture now that if we don't go ahead and take action on it, it's going to delay setting up the advisory committees, which is going to make it almost impossible on the calendar for them to have a meaningful role in the RFP process for next year's funding, because we need to form those councils. That work needs to start in February to actually begin the RFPs, and has to conclude by June. So it's tight. Does anybody have a comment or a question about the structure as proposed? All right. Jim?
Wasn't sure if you were waiting for others first, so I'll just jump in because I was the one that slowed us down because I missed a meeting at the last meeting. So I figure I'll tell you what I'm thinking today. I did send an email to the committee member or the council members and the lead staff. I think I had kind of a couple of concerns at the last meeting. I will admit, I was super passionate, and I think I was over recalling how many of us were actually at the retreat even I missed the first day. Had a pretty clear vision from the conversation in the last couple hours of the second day, which not all of us were at. My, sort of, sorry, I'm trying to get to my note so I don't miss it. I think in my mind, I was also jumbling a little bit the voting of the hat with the voting of people with lived experience that we talked about having be a steering committee that was leading the way rather than sort of in the middle of an organizational chart. And that piece for me, I think is a better conversation for the permanent structure. When I think about the hat vote, I'm clearly a super minority, but I also do not understand the logic and reasoning behind not having hat have a vote. I think, to me, when I reviewed the homeless crisis response plan, they're actually a more significant piece of the system than us 5 elected officials are, largely responsible for the implementation of many goals in that plan. And and people are saying, well, there's not a model, it's our fiduciary authority, and we have to make sure that we don't have legal risk, and I get all of that, and I'm largely going to succumb to that being part of the permanent conversation, but only to point out, if folks can reinforce their reasoning, it would be helpful to me. I asked the Mayor Pro Tem Gilman of Olympia last night, who serves on intercity transit, and he let me know that they actually have community members voting on the Transit Authority Board, and I believe they're bigger than the Port of Olympia, and have direct taxing authority. So, to me, that is a really clear model of how we could have community members from the system sitting as voting members, but as a minority, the super minority, I'm not necessarily going to push on that. The one thing that I would like to request pretty strongly is that we integrate the current housing action team of Thurston Thrives and their organizational chart into our high-level organizational chart, so it at least identifies the major components of the public system on one piece of paper. And I'm not meaning to do that as a change in the workflow pictures that are shown, and I'm not meaning to do that as any change in the sponsoring organization of Thurston Thrives and their housing action team. Though it's also really clear to me that Thurston County's Office of Housing and Homeless Prevention is staffing the entire structure of the housing action team and its subcommittees. So to me, it's seemingly already part of the Regional Housing Council. It's just not on paper that way. So that's where I'm at today, and I look forward to the conversation. Sorry to be a little long-winded. Thank you.
Danny?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in, in terms of having a vote. Transportation Policy Board, we have 3 business members, which actually includes nonprofits, TVWs represented, and we have 2 community members that all vote. So there are definitely models out there for that. I'm wondering, if the challenge is, updating the ILA and having that formally included, and there's a process associated with that we would need to go through, and I know there's been a call to update the ILA anyway, so maybe that's a conversation to be had. And also, Jim, I just have a question, just to clarify, because I looked at your org, the org chart that you put forward, and I hear you saying that you don't imagine that having any impact to workflow. Is the goal just to have the hat there somewhere so they see that we know that they are working on things as well? So I guess there's a disconnect in terms of having them included in the org chart somewhere, and then also not having it impact the flow of work.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So for me, the 2 pieces stand out, and that's they show up all of a sudden. So where do these members come from? And this acknowledgement helps demonstrate that. But also their subcommittee, the Homeless Housing Hub, is the balance of state continuum of care committee that's required, I believe, for some of the funding sources that we are putting under the regional housing council. And so to me, this shows the complete system, well, most of the complete system as we use it, realizing that there's a lot of work to do to clear everything up, because the RHC is not in the 5-year plan either. So
So just to follow up on that, like, and I'd be curious to hear, like, from staff on this, like, so they're already involved in the workflow somehow, and the way that you've added them into the work chart, sorry, I'm getting my words mixed up. The way that you've added them into the org chart, like, does that reflect like the role that they have in the process, or does I just don't want to put something out there that is confusing, or I just want to make sure it makes sense to everybody.
And I think that's reflected well in the subsequent workflow charts where they do show up, to me, but others might have a different opinion.
Well, let's break this into pieces, because we've got 2 or 3 big things right here on the table. At our last meeting, Michael gave a pretty cogent response to part of the question that was raised about the voting status. Michael, would you mind kind of just hitting the highlights of that again? You said it so well before.
Sure, and I attended the retreat for both days. I had to do so digitally over Zoom because I got exposed to COVID like 36 hours beforehand, which sucked. But I heard a lot of and expressed a lot of sentiment about the importance of looking at a long-term structure that embodies decision-making, authority sharing. I personally don't recall a single instance where we said that we were going to have voting members on the RHC who were not elected officials, but I also recall the language being very broad and think that interpreting what we did say to include that is a very reasonable interpretation. I think like my perspective on this is sort of rooted in the basis that formed this organization in the first place, when it was the ad hoc committee, which was at least in part sort of a response to the need for city and county to work together to make some of these decisions so that there's public accountability for where the dollars flow, which could have a few sort of sources in policy. One is for public accountability to make sure that, if something happens at the end of the day where a dollar is misspent, then there is responsibility laid at our feet, for better or worse, because we are fiduciaries of these dollars. And I still feel a connection to that sort of original mission. I think the way that you framed it, Jim, as, when we look at the permanent structure for examining other ways in which we can accomplish power sharing, maybe that does mean voting. I'm open to having that conversation for the permanent structure. I think this is a little bit distinguishable from some of the other boards that do have citizen members, or I should say resident members, not citizen members, resident members, in part because some of these are the people who are doing the work. When I think of like the transportation, like TRPC, or some of the other boards that have non-elected official members on them, the folks on the transportation board are not the chip sealers of the world, right? Like they're people who are in the community who have an interest. And I think that as we explore the permanent structure, that's something that I would be very open to. I think part of this concern was if the people who are doing the work who are also then the ones signing off on the checks that go to themselves, that was one of the primary concerns we came around. And I think that if we're really thoughtful around what kind of sideboards can we build in to ensure that there aren't conflicts of interest, then that's a conversation I'd love to be a part of and would love to have as we decide a permanent structure. So that's kind of where I am on that piece. I think adding HAT into the org chart makes sense to me, because I think that kind of reflects how things currently work anyway. like the hat already has relationships with some of the entities that then bring the recommendations to us. So if we're building in new entities that bring recommendations to the RHC, then it, you know, I think that just sort of embodies the way I was sort of envisioning it would work anyway. So that makes sense.
I'm not sure who can provide an answer or if there is an answer to this yet, but one of the things that occurred to me when I was looking at Jim's proposed chart is what, if any, legal effect having the action teams within HAT listed at the very bottom there would have in terms of standing, in terms of whether that would have any effect at all on the conversation about whether the HAT representatives on the actual housing council would be full members or ex officio non-voting members. Anyone want to take a swing at that?
To me, that all depends on what you write in the accompanying documents that back up. This is just a picture that we use to guide our work.
Can I jump in here?
Please do.
So we just had a discussion about the Regional Housing Council and the org chart and everything at a recent work session with the Lacey City Council. And, you know, let's all remind ourselves at some point, this is we'll have to come back through the jurisdictions for approval of the ILA. So it's important that all of our councils are aware as we're going along, because at the end of the day, they're going to have to vote to change the ILA. That being said, how it was originally proposed to us with the org chart, I think we all feel it's really important that HAT, which is made up of so many different levels of people within HAT. And so I guess what it really depends on is who we're talking about within the HAT structure at different levels, and where are they most important in bringing forward good recommendations that's going to benefit, you know, our communities. And I think the big question that we had at the time, where we're still sort of struggling with, and we're obviously, I think, sort of talking it through here now as well, is there going to be a scenario where you're going to have someone at various levels, the same person at various levels of the decision-making process? So for example, you know, are we going to be in a situation where we have like a member of, you know, the chair of our planning commission also be a voting member or a non-voting member at the city council level, right? No one would think that makes sense. Those are two different sort of roles. You want your planning commission to do the deep work, make a good recommendation, and at the end of the day, it's up to the city council to accept that recommendation or modify it or send it back. And so the org chart really is important here. And we need to be thinking about where do we have the right people getting us to a recommendation that everyone feels is a great recommendation, and it's going to move our communities forward and make real progress when it comes to these several different issues that we're discussing. Before, you know, and there's a lot of things that go on within the Regional Housing Council. It's not just permanent supportive housing. It's not just rapid rehousing. And there's a whole host of things. So we have to think about that. All those different issues the Regional Housing Council is asked to look at. How do we get good recommendations all the way through the pipeline to funding? And so, again, it depends on this org chart of who's where, and where's the best place for them to be. Is if we have a member of the HAT as a voting or non-voting member at the council level, then that sort of precludes them from being a participant, you know, going down, developing policies, so on and so forth, because you wouldn't want that same person in multiple places along that route. You know, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I think, again, we need to figure out where is the best place for people along the way to give us good policy, give us good recommendations. And in many ways, I think if we put members of the hat at the council level, that it sort of prevents them from being the experts in some cases of coming up with the good policy recommendations and funding recommendations. Because as the org chart goes, I mean, it's the housing council is basically the last place, one of the last places we go. I mean, we before it goes off to funding, you know, we do make a final decision, but all the work happens underneath the council level. And that's where the hat should be very well represented, in my opinion, and not necessarily at the council level. And so that's something we all need to think about. But I don't think we should have that same person who's coming up with a policy and the recommendations also be voting for the final policy and recommendations at the regional housing council level. That doesn't make sense. We don't see that anyplace else in all of our intergovernmental boards and commissions. You know, there is a separation between making the policy and then making the final decision.
You're muted, Carolyn.
Sorry, we have lots of construction going on here. I'm trying to save your ears. I want to take just a second, Tom, to call on Brian Hess, because we can't see Brian, and just to see if he has any questions or comments on this, and then we'll go next to Tom.
I apologize. I was trying to get myself unmuted. I was listening to the last speaker and the statement of policy and then voting on the policy. I see us as a council as the legislature element, if you want to put it into the way government is. We're the ones that are voting on the purse, how to spend money. We also vote on policy, not necessarily policy, but the element that's before the policy, where policy is developed. And so I'm a little confused on how we're putting policy before we put ahead of legislation. And maybe I'm not making sense on this. I'm trying to think of the right terms. You have your laws, from the laws come the policies, from the policies come, how are we going to implement it and working our way down. We're the ones who are writing the equivalency of the laws in some ways by trying to figure out what direction we want to go. So I think having the hat, if they happen to be smart on helping us guide in a direction, that might be the way to go. But to say that on a council, you don't create policy and then vote on it, I almost want to say I disagree with that statement, because as a council member, if there's something that I truly believe in that needs to be done for the city of Yelm, and I can craft the policy and sit down with a group of people and craft it and then present it to the council, it doesn't mean that I step away from saying I'm excluded from voting on it because I wrote it. And I don't know, maybe I'm not making sense, but as I said, that's just the way I see it. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure. I mean, the role of the hat, if they are to be the tech people, then no, we don't want them voting, because then they vote on the money that they want to spend, and they may be that deciding vote, depending on how the balancing of the voting goes. That's all. That's my concerns. I mean, I'm open, I'm listening, and I'm learning at the same time. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Brian. Tom?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to respond to Mayor Ryder's comment and to let folks know we have developed a draft charter for the advisory boards. And within that, we try to lay out some of those rules that individuals who would serve on an advisory board would not be eligible to serve at the Rhc level to avoid some of those issues. So it is very much a first draft of the charter for how these boards would work. But we have tried to lay out some of the basic rules of who would be allowed. Individuals couldn't serve on more than one board, although representatives from different organizations from the same organization may be on multiple boards. So we've tried to lay out some of those rules in the charter. We haven't had detailed discussions about that with you yet, because we haven't quite gotten there. But within that charter, we do hope to lay out some of those rules to identify some of the structure for how these boards would work. So.
All right. Who else? Okay. Well, speaking only for myself, I think that it should be pretty clear to everyone that the Regional Housing Council has made a valiant effort to embrace the HAT and its members and their expertise and the work that they're doing. I personally, and maybe my bright line is a little brighter than somebody else's bright line, but my difficulty is with the voting status is that I don't think that an organization that's representing a potential recipient of the funding that we have responsibility for recommending to the county commissioners how that money is to be spent should have a vote on that funding. I'm perfectly happy with having them at the advisory level make, score applications. I'm perfectly happy with them suggesting the priorities to be addressed with the funding, the next funding round, and all that. But when it actually comes to voting on how public money is to be spent, that's where I have difficulty within this present model. Now, I'm like Jim, I'm like Andy and Michael, that this is a temporary solution. This is sort of the interval that gets us from basically an ad hoc committee that's graduated to having interlocal agreement that brought us to this stage, and we're hoping to get to a next level where we're actually our own organization. And I think that can look like anything. I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities, and I don't think we would be quite as hamstrung, if you will, with ethics rules and that sort of thing. I mean, not that we wouldn't have ethical responsibility for the money, but I just think that it would be a little bit different, kind of an animal. So still open to hearing comments, but I do think we ought to make a decision today. Jim, I couldn't.
You have Darian, and then Carolina, and then Keely. They come up in order of their hand raise.
All right. Well, then let's start with Darian.
Yeah, I'm just hearing that we don't have a current model like this in our housing structure. And I just want to remind folks that our current home fund board is set up just like this. People who apply to receive funding of the home fund board sit on the home fund board, and they recuse themselves when they have applications submitted, and those awards go to our city council for approval, just like the RHC, then go to the Board of County Commissioners for final approval. So we do have a model currently in the community that's working very well. So something that we could look to emulate here if we want to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. Carolina?
Thank you. I brought this matter up to the full board to discuss. I wanted to see what their perspective was on this topic, and I had Keely and Tom help me out on that. So thank you both. And just with the conversation that we had, there was concurrence that kind of the board stands basically with, I think what was relayed at the last meeting, that we're okay with HAT members being in the RHC structure, but no voting for now. And partly, Thurston County is the fiduciary agent of the RHC currently, and just with that structure, it's just the relation that we think at this time it's not what where we're at.
Thank you, Carol. Keely? You're up.
I just wanted to bring up another example, which actually Councilmember Cooper brought up earlier, which is the balance of state. So at a statewide level, the Triple H, the Homeless Housing Hub, is counted on to be making policy and funding recommendations as per the state on the 5-year plan, on all the things that I just mentioned. I don't need to repeat. Also, there are voting members that are providers, and they receive pass-through funds from the Balance of State COC. And there are voting members that apply for those funds, review other applications. They also review on statewide policy, or they also vote on statewide policy. They're considered that their vote is very powerful at it for the Balance of State. So I just want to put it out there that it's absolutely, it's not. I guess just another example of how this model already exists with the agencies that are already in our community at the Balance of State COC.
All right.
So yeah, just one thought as I've heard all of you talking. I don't hear a sway in the leaning of the group on the vote, but I do want to make sure. So one of the things last year when I was running for re-election, I had an opportunity like Carolyn to talk about, founding this body and why we did it. And one of the more common questions was, where's the opportunity for business and developers to participate in the housing policy conversation? And that's at the affordable housing team of HAT. And so to me, I lift that up to demonstrate that there's a lot more than just service providers on the structure of HAT. The senior group is, some awesome retirees who used to work in service provision. And so not to try to, this is not a last ditch effort to change your vote, but just to let's as we move towards a permanent conversation, really make sure we dig in and understand the whole structure and who's sitting around the table, because I don't think it's quite it's not the home consortium advisory committee that everyone is talking about in between the lines as the thing that they're worried about happening again. And so I just need to say that out loud. And I didn't hear anyone push back on just adding the HAT picture onto the org chart. So Carolyn, I'm at your pleasure if you want me to make a motion or not.
Just trying to see if there were any other hands raised. Before we move to a motion, I just want to check in with staff to see if you all have any comments. Ramiro, Tom, Brad, Scott, John, if he's still here. Any of you have anything you'd like to say to weigh in on this question before we get to a motion?
Just to echo what Commissioner Mejia stated, the board engaged on a good conversation on Tuesday morning yesterday. And this particular question of representation of the HUD members and the voting and no voting members was unanimous. As Commissioner Mejia stated, the board unanimously agreed not to have the HUD members being a voting member.
Okay, thanks, Ramiro. Anybody else? Andy?
Just want to jump in one last time. I think it's absolutely important that the HAT members, the senior team, the business affordable housing group have a prominent role in talking about the policies and the recommendations that will eventually go up for consideration to the Regional Housing Council and on to the county in this form, right? Where the final form, what this all looks like, is yet to be determined. And so we are just talking about this interim level. And I think it's really important that we have a wide variety of people that are helping coming up with the policies and recommendations for funding. What's again, it just matters who are those HAT members at the end of the day that may at some point be on the council. And I think that's a good conversation to have at some point. There's just like a lot of uncertainty of which HAT members are we talking about, who's where in the org chart along the way. And there could be an org chart that has a member of the business community, the member of lived experience, and a member of the senior, right? There could be three of them that sit at the Regional Housing Council level that I would be in support of. I'm not sure. It depends on who the person is and what organization they're representing. I think the big question is do you have a member of a nonprofit who is coming up with a policy, and is at several stages along the way, all the way to the council level. And just because you recuse yourself at the council level doesn't mean you don't participate in a lot of different conversations along the way. It does kind of skew things at the end of the day. And I think it's the unknown of who that person is that we're talking, who the HAT members are at the council level. We haven't really identified that yet. And that's what's throwing a lot of confusion in here. And so I think that's why I think, at least from the Lacey City Council, when we talk this out, we feel more comfortable with being a non-voting member, not knowing who that non-voting member is going to be, right? And so it could be that non-voting member adds a ton of value along the way, and we advocate for them to be a part of the final structure. And maybe that's the way it turns out. That'd be great. But it's the not knowing. It's not. We haven't identified who that person is that's sort of holding us up to get to this final. Can it be a voting or non-voting member at the end of the day? So I just want to know, Jim, I know where you're coming from. There's just so much uncertainty on who you're talking, who that person is. That's, I think, holding myself back and holding maybe some of us else back on the voting, non-voting side of things.
Okay. Before we move to a motion, I'd like to check in with Tom. Are you looking for a vote on more than the HAT role in terms of voting membership? Are you also looking for a vote on the charter?
Yeah, at this point, and I see Brian has his hand up, so I want to make sure you get to him. But to answer your question, if we can if ready to vote on the org structure as Councilmember Cooper presented it, including the HAT that includes 2 non-voting members, that would be great. This just allows us to move forward with developing that charter, and then we can start identifying what are the amendments to the ILA that are needed. Then that allows us to kind of start moving forward those next steps. So if you're able and willing and ready to kind of approve the organizational chart as presented by Councilmember Cooper that includes the HAT and the 2 HAT members as non-voting members, then that allows us to move forward. That would be great.
Okay, let's hear from Brian, and then we'll call for a motion.
Yes, I was just a little concerned with what the mayor had to say when he was saying we don't know who's going to fill that role. And so if it's a good person, yeah, let's go ahead and have them become a voting member. I always look at things as your set precedents. We need to, if it all depends on who the person is, then no, there should be no voting thing, because if you know that there could be a bad actor that fills the role, you can't say okay one time and then not okay the next time. And so that is something that I would like to bring into the conversation to just think about after hearing what he had to say in reference to what's holding up on if it's going to be a voting member or not. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Brian. Could I, sorry, I'm losing power here. Could I, if you all can hear me, could I call for a motion?
Yeah, I can make one, Carolyn.
Thanks.
Let me just make sure everybody saw my drawing and I don't need to put it on the screen. Okay. So I move for approval of the interim regional housing council organizational structure as discussed today, including the housing action team and 2 non-voting members of the housing action team on the regional housing council.
Do I hear a second?
I'll second.
Is that Michael?
Yes.
Okay, so it's been moved by Jim, seconded by Michael. Any further discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion carries unanimously.
Carolyn, can I just make a quick comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you for the discussion. And one thing, to come back to the mayor's comments that we have done here that's different than hardly any other interlocal or government body I've seen in my life is create an inclusive conversation for everyone at the table. And I know that's what it will be regardless of who the voting members are. I think case in point is our managers have as much voice as we do, and that's not the same in other places where we sit down. So I just appreciate being part of this organization, and thank you for that.
Thanks, Jim. And it's just, as chair, a point of personal privilege, I just want to express my appreciation for the members of the Housing Action Team. I've been going to their meetings for 5 years now, and they're all, to a person, wonderful, kind of selfless people. And I would never want any of them to think that I don't value them or think that they have a place at the table. My concerns are strictly, let's do what we have to do to remove any potential conflict of interest, and at the same time work on a new model that we will gradually get to that does find a way to bring them in more fully. But I think giving them seats at both the advisory councils and at the regional housing council itself is a big gesture toward HAT, and I hope they understand that. So thank you all. This has been a hard conversation.
Carolyn, can I add a point as well, if you'll allow me?
Yeah, sure.
I know we're running out on time, so I apologize, but I just the board's discussion was never on who was going to sit from the hat on the table. It was more of, there's still so many things that are unanswered, such as the ILA. That was kind of our big holdup, that I think there's so many unresolved matters still holding up just for the jurisdictions to bring in 2 additional voting members would just create more confusion. And at this time, I think it's definitely something to consider as we're heading into the long term and that long-term structure. But right now, with just so many unresolved questions up, I think we have a great vision for the future, and but we just still need to address things between the jurisdictions.
And I also want to say, I think Olympia has a great process for specifically for their home fund, right? They have a great group of people that make good recommendations that are doing great work in the city of Olympia. And I'd like to see that expanded, countywide. But those people who are making the recommendations do not sit on the Olympia City Council, right? They make their recommendations, and the Olympia City Council is the one that then approves them or not. And so there is a separation there, but you have a great process. And I think we should follow that, you know, a very similar process like that. There just has to be the separation between the council and the ones making the recommendation, in my opinion. So that's my last 2 cents.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, anybody else? Okay, seeing none. Why don't we've got a couple minutes left. Why don't we do quick good of the order? Things coming up that others should know about? Any good news, bad news to share?
I'll just say, if you haven't checked out Quinn Street Village, you can probably reach out to Darian or Rich and set up a time for that. It's really exciting.
Great. I've been watching it driving by. It's coming right along.
And I would like to add from Yelm side, we're beginning our budget process, and part of the proposed budget was helping continue to fund our senior center, as well as Habitat for Humanity with their work that they're doing within Yelm.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Michael?
On Wednesday, October 12th, our general government committee for the city will be having a meeting. We'll be discussing some tenant protection policies at that meeting.
Great. Is that something you'd be willing to share with other jurisdictions when they're a little more formalized?
Sure, some of it is similar to what Olympia accomplished recently, but maybe after we sort of see where we land, it makes sense to kind of talk about both of those at this regional level.
Okay. Well, why don't we get that on a future agenda when you think it's appropriate, Michael? Okay. Anybody else? Andy, is there anything you want to throw in from Lacey or Scott?
No, I don't have anything. I just want to can reiterate, I think what Jim says is that what we've been able to do here so far is truly, you know, it's really amazing. It's pretty cool that all the jurisdictions have come together to try to do what, you know, what's best for our community. And I only see really good things coming forward out of the Regional Housing Council.
Right. Thanks for that. And I guess I would add to my, you know, timing of urgency, if we needed to get this decision done today, is that as soon as we can get the Home Fund County and Olympia agreed to and get that moving, we can begin hiring the staff that will start to take some of the burden off of our other jurisdictional staff. And I don't know what that has looked like so much in Olympia, but I know it's been really tough on Lacey staff. And I think any relief will be welcome there. And I really want to appreciate the county staff. I mean, you all have shouldered so much and had to dig in on so much with, you know, trying to find new providers and, you know, getting proposals out to the state on new funding. And I mean, it's just on and on and on. And you have an incredible team there. And my hat is off to you. Jim?
You just said something that made me remember I see one thing just that I want to suggest for the next steps after the interim structure. And that's that we need to consider a budget for the home fund, because that will drive what we spend on staffing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good one. Anything else? Going once. All righty. Well, I'm going to give you a 6-minute gift of time then. I'm hearing no objections. We'll go ahead and adjourn. So thanks, everybody.
Hey, everyone.
Take
Now
care.
Michael can get to Mensa.
And I can get to interfaith works. So-